business analysis governance. So what do you mean by governance? I think we discussed this. What do you mean by governance? What do you understand by the term governance? What do you think would be the key focus from this particular activity?
Key thing from the activity. So what do you mean? What's my understanding of the governance?
Yeah, business analysis governance. So we discussed this in the first section of day one. We're talking about governance and what does that include. So the structure, isn't it? So essentially it includes the structure, the kind of hierarchy, the team, and the procedures, the policies, the rules. If there is any escalation, if there's any slippage, anything that is not expecting, that is behaving in a manner that is not expected, then how would you escalate? And these kind of things would be done in the governance structure. So the people, the roles. So in this one, what you're trying to do is, again, the inputs for this one is the one that we created earlier, the business analysis approach, which was from the first, which was the output from the first subsection, right? And then the stakeholder engagement approach is the output from the second one, 1.2. So those would become the inputs for this activity, right? And then you do the planning of the business analysis governance. Again, planning, it's not doing it's not the governance activity. You're actually planning for how would you like to do the governance later, all through the life cycle of the project, or the product development, whatever. And then the final output for this particular activity would be the governance approach, right? And what are the tasks that you would typically use? So you have got the plan, business analysis, information management. You would have an assessment of the requirements change. You would prioritize the requirements, and then you would approve the requirements. So these are the tasks that you would use, not now, but they would be the kind of tasks that you would use all through the project. So what you do is, for this, because you're doing the planning, you would consider these kind of tasks and see what are required. What is setup that is required so that you can understand the requirements changes, right? There should be a change requirement, control board, project change control board, as I say, PCCB, and then there should be an organizational wide change control board. Then there should be a way to prioritize the requirements. How are you prioritizing the requirements? What tools and techniques you would use? Who can prioritize? Who is going to take the decision about the final requirements, whether they're right or wrong, whether they're prioritized or not? So all of these are going to be the key tasks that you would do all through. But then, because you're doing the governance planning, you need to consider those tasks now, and then start planning for those as to who is responsible for doing those later, right? So in terms of the guidelines, so you've got business analysis, performance assessment, right? So who is performing how in terms of their role, their job, their tasks that they're doing, how good they're performing, what kind of policies for the business or around business analysis and business analysis policies, the procedures, the current state description, again, the as-is description of the current state, and then the legal or regulatory information, the business rules. If it is to do with healthcare, what kind of regulatory information? If it is to do with banking, and similar kind of setup, then if it's a financial services sector, what kind of regulations should be considered? If it's something to do with retail, what kind of things? What is the health and safety considerations? All of those need to be considered if you want to draw the governance plan. So this is what you would do in the planning of the business analysis governance activity. You define how the decisions are made about requirements and design. Again, you're defining here, you're not actually taking decisions about requirements now. You're planning, you're still planning. So just need to really have a clear understanding of that. You're planning how the decisions will be made later, or all through the life cycle of your project, or the life cycle of the product development initiative. How the decision would be made, who would make the decisions, who would carry out the decisions once they're made, how would you prioritize? All of them are going to be done and planned now at this stage. It's just planning. And so this also includes decisions about reviews, prioritization, change control, approvals, blah, 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 the workflow. So decision makers and required information exist. All of that needs to be in place. The process, decision makers, and required information, right? All of that. this is where the governance process come into picture and how decisions regarding approvals, blah, blah. So whatever we've discussed so far. So this is basically a setup to help you prepare for how you can enable the decision making all through the life cycle about requirements and business analysis process. So that's what is important here. So when we talk about governance, basically there are about 4 or 5. So what BA needs to hear, we need to look at the change control process. If there are some changes that are coming in from the customer, from the users, from the senior management, from the stakeholders, from the quality control team, how are we going to deal with the changes? Who is going to look at those impact of the changes? Who is going to say yes or no, the go or no go decision, right? And then how would you take the approval once the change has been approved? Who will put that into the process? Who will put that as the prioritized list of item that needs to go into the backlog, for example, in Agile? And who's going to take the decision about when that needs to be implemented? If a change came in, for example, we were talking about the Sonos play bar support for the Dolby that people had been asking, all the customers and the users had been asking for. There are about, let's say, 100,000 users had been requesting that feature of Dolby support in the play bar. That is what has been coming in from the user forum of your Sonos website. Then who would take a decision? Who has got the product owner of Playbar, for example, has got the final say as to what feature is going to put in what release. So he would take the decision, he or she would take the decision. And then based on that, once the decision is done, when is that going to be prioritized? The Dolby support feature within the Playbar. When? Is it for the fall 2021? Is it for fall 2022? Is it for the spring 2022? When is that? And what release? Is it minor release, major release? And what is going to be the approach to implement that? If it is prioritized for fall 2021, are we in a good position? Do we have the team to execute that? Do we have the technology to support it? Do we have the application, the software, the hardware, whatever the suppliers of the components? Would they be in a ready position to give us the specific component that would help us in implementing this Dolby support feature, right? All of these things come into picture. This is what you're talking about, governance. You're not actually deciding now whether you're supporting the Dolby thing or not, whether you've got a specific feature or not. What is important is whether we have got the structure and the board, the structure, the team, the process, the policies, the rules, and the way you get the things done, the procedures. Are we all clear with that? That's what is important in the planning of the business analysis governance. So what kind of techniques would you use here? So brainstorming, again, very important. We have discussed this. It's basically you're trying to understand, throw a few ideas, get some ideas. Don't just say this is bad idea, good idea. Trying to get all the ideas now and then look at the efficacy of each idea. But again, do the document analysis. We look at the vision, the roadmap. We look at the overall organization strategy, the vision, and then we look at some of the interviews with the senior management, senior stakeholders, the governance team. Perhaps even looking at the auditing team, for example, who are at the very high level. We'll look at the board. We'll talk to the board persons to understand what is the potential impact of this particular sort of structure in the first place. We'll have, again, item tracking in the sense a requirement, a task, a technical task, a feature, change request, a defect. How does that get notified into the product backlog or into the requirements? And how does that go through this whole cycle from the backlog all the way through to the implementation and then delivery? What are the lessons learned in terms of how we have done before? What kind of lessons we can learn from our past experiences? And then organizational modeling, very, very important. Just like scope modeling, we've got organizational modeling. So here we've talked about the governance, the board structure, the governance, the kind of, the roles described, who is the chairman, who is the president, who is the secretary. If it's to do with the change control board, again, who is the decision maker, who is the chairperson for this particular change control board at the organizational level, and then at the project level or the product level, who can take a call. And once they take a call, can that be overridden? In case of what? Who can take the final say? Who is accountable? So all those things would come into picture. Again, the organizational structure would be built. And then process modeling, again, we discussed yesterday in the context of the BPMN, the business process modeling notation, trying to create the activity models, the process models, identifying the workflows, where do we need the intervention, how does that really get affected, what is the recruitment process, what's the training process, what's the process involved in development, which process are we trying to address with respect to the governance. Do we have to have all the processes in the organization, or do we have to look at only our team's processes? Should we have some of the other things like support processes like IT infrastructure support, networking, HR, training, recruitment? They're not really what we do as part of development, but they're support processes. So in which case, how can we handle them? Do we have to have a separate team to address those? So all of those things are discussed, and decisions taken about that. And again, reviews, look at the reviews, the peer reviews, the board reviews, decisions taken about coming out from the reviews, the outcomes, and how we are going to address those. Again, change control board should be put into form of a change control board sequence flow. Service questionnaires, again, not very effective. They just put it here, but then they're not really effective at this stage. Perhaps you would use it for identifying what could be the areas that we need to address. But again, I'm not a big fan of surveys. And workshops are very effective. Just like interviews, we've got a single objective of taking some decisions, putting the middle management or the project managers of other teams, trying to get them all on board, and then trying to take some kind of consensus, arrive at a consensus or a decision about a particular outcome. Again, very, very important in that aspect as well. So that brings us to these ones, the stakeholders again. Who are the stakeholders involved in this? So when we talk about again, the governance, we're talking about the key stakeholders involved. So the sponsor is very, very important here. Obviously, the business sponsor, the project sponsor, who hold the money, who have got that the budgets for this particular project. They're very important. Domain subject matter experts in terms of whichever domain, whether it's retail, whether it's banking. So people who have been there, done that, who have got the experience, who've got that the expertise with respect to that particular area. They are of great value for us to identify and draw these structures, identify the procedures, come up with the governance aspects of it, create the rules, the way it should be behaving, write the templates, the procedures, and the stuff like that. So we typically take a lot of umbrage from these SMEs. And project managers and program managers, portfolio managers, typically these are the people at this stage. They're the people who can really become handy in terms of creating the project plans, the Gantt charts, and the drawing out the responsibilities of who does what kind of a thing. So having a high level project plan at this stage is very important. Not necessarily all the details, but again, just to kind of get us going with respect to the governance structure, the model that we can put in place for who would be doing what, and what kind of procedures are involved, what are the other dependencies, the constraints, what kind of projects that we have done before, how can we bring in all of those. So essentially across the various teams, if we can bring in the lessons learned, the kind of best practices into this particular project's governance, I think that would be really helpful. So project manager is a great role to be involved, and then understanding and perhaps taking a bit more proactive role in laying out the governance structure. And regulators, obviously, as we discussed, very, very important. We need to know what kind of models and what kind of laws and rules and the clauses and everything else that has been laid down by the specific regulator. If it is with based on the industry, obviously, if it is to do with finance and banking, then we have got the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, FCA. And if you've got the healthcare, then you've got the Department of Health and Health and Safety and things like that. There are a lot of HL7, HIPAA guidelines that need to be followed. If it's with building contractors and construction piece of work, then you've got a lot of the local regulations. Then you've got the specific industry guidelines on health and safety. All of those need to be considered. So that's the reason why governance, because again, you're talking about governance, it's important you consult the respective regulator and then the specific body which actually does the regulation activity of that particular industry or the vertical. We take into consideration, we put them into practice, we make sure that we have got pretty much all of those in in terms of the structure, the way the procedures are written, the tools, the techniques that we use, the way the complaint handling, the feedback handling happens, the escalation, if there's any issue or any complaint or any, if they're not happy, the customers views are not happy, how can they feed us back? How can they get in touch? How can that issue be resolved? If it is not resolved within a period of time, how can that be escalated to the next level? All of these need to be thought about at this stage. Again, this is not the activity about doing things, about about the escalation and the issue management, but it's about planning and preparation for that. It's about setting this whole thing in place so that we can implement it in across the life cycle of the project. So that's the whole idea of this particular stage again. So when we talk about, for example, the business analysis stage, and we are talking about the governance here, again, there are a lot of areas that we need to be concerned about in terms of the governance. As we discussed earlier with regulatory stuff, we have got our own organizational guidelines and the governance. We've got quality control bodies and things like that. So we just need to keep into consideration. There are a few things that need to be clearly mentioned. The business analysis performance assessment. These are the guidelines and tools that we need to consider, the measures, the metrics, and the various critical success factors, the policies, procedures, the rules, the business rules, and the industry specific rules and regulations, the exceptions. All of those need to be, again, information management tools. Again, this is to do with the communication channels, what kind of communication that needs to be sent out. We're using Jira or we're using some kind of these aspects. We need to be really clear with respect to what kind of policies, what kind of procedures we want to typically lay in place. And that's why this is very, very important that we have all of these in place to make sure, number one, we have got the communication clear, and number two, if there's anything that goes wrong, that could potentially go wrong, we've got enough controls in place to take corrective action, and then to ensure that it doesn't happen again, which is what we call as a preventive action. And the legal or regulatory information, which is again very important. We discussed this at length in terms of the specific industry and what kind of frameworks we should have, what kind of regulations and the rules and the escalation mechanisms that should be in place. Again, what we're talking about is not doing things but planning. So just keep that in mind. Having these well in advance and thought about is very important for us to have in the business analysis approaches. Sorry. So in terms of the tasks that could potentially use, we're going to discuss that later. So communicate business analysis information that would use the governance approach, which is this approach that is the output from this one. And then you'll also have the tracing of requirements or requirements traceability. So that's a very, very important aspect or activity that a business analyst would really be engaged all the way through in a life cycle. So tracing the requirements from the stage they are identified as something to be done, like customer feedback, and then that goes into the requirements repository or product backlog, then the architecture, then the high-level design, then low-level design, then the development, then testing, and then deploying, right? So this whole thing, what we call as from requirements all the way through to the test cases and finally the code that has been released, is what we call as forward traceability. So that is forward, it's going from requirements forward. And backward traceability is opposite of it. So once you've got a code, a piece of code or a test case, tracing that all the way from there to the architecture, and then from the architecture to the design, from there to the requirement, and finally to where it came through, whether it has come through from an issue reported by a customer, or whether it has come through from a product owner's idea, or from a team member's way of suggestion from a sprint planning. All of these, so you're actually referring the test case all the way through, you're tracing it back to the requirement, or even before that, the source of requirement. So that's called as backward requirement. So there is a forward requirement, forward traceability requirement in terms of tracing it from the requirement through to the design, design architecture, the component, and from there to the code, and from there to the test case and the test result. And the backward traceability is the opposite of that, tracing all the way
Where
back
do
to the
you use
requirement.
this?
You can potentially use in all the requirements development, and in fact, I've used it in almost all the projects with what we call as Rational Requisite Pro. That's a very good requirements management tool. So that it has got this ability to automatically trace what has been done as part of a particular requirement, and then it links that requirement to the design document, a section in the design document, and then to the specific block of code in your repository, and to the test cases associated with that requirement. So that's called Rec Pro, REQPRO, Rational Requisite Pro.
Yeah.
It's a tool. And in Jira, we use it every day. So for example, if you have got some change that is suggested by a customer, and then you have got that in the backlog, from the backlog, you created that story that is there in the product backlog, and then that gets prioritized in a sprint backlog. From there, for that particular story, you write a set of test cases. All of them are maintained in Jira. Nowadays, thanks to Agile, you don't have to use 10 different tools like how we were using before. So with Jira or any such tool like Trello or Jira, you can actually have one place like the user story, and connected to that, you can see the entire user story going through the life cycle of the development, and then you can trace it all the way back and forth. So that's the beauty of Agile development and the tools that we use. Some of the tools like, and that's why it's called ALM tools, Application Lifecycle Management Tool. So maintaining requirements, again, maintenance of requirements and repository, making sure you've got all of those in one place, and you can, back and forth change the requirements. You can move the requirements from one place to another place. You can change the priorities or the order of how the requirements happen. You can break the big requirements, the epics, into smaller ones like the stories. You can merge the smaller ones like the stories into one big one like epic. You can do all of these things, and that's all part of the maintenance of the requirements. So basically, that is another way to address this, and then define the requirements architecture. So this is basically, again, definition of requirements architecture is you're talking about how you would handle the flow of requirements, whether it is requirement identification of the classification of the requirements, whether it is a requirement, or whether it is a function requirement, or whether it's a task, whether it's a non-functional requirement, usability, security requirement, or is it reliability, performance requirement, all of those, the FERPs plus kind of a thing requirement. And then once you have that, how would you be able to then translate it from that stage to the next one? What are the related stuff? However, the assumptions, the dependencies, the constraints, the challenges, all of that you would define in an architecture. Again,